television program. My guest today is Kevin Bales, who is here to discuss his book, Disposable People, New Slavery in the Global Economy. What a book. I found already in talking with different people that your book, Disposable People, and its subject, global slavery, is really high-charged discourse, full of conflict and confrontation, and people who are scholars who are normally kind of reticent start challenging the assertion that there's these 27 million people or millions of people around the world who are enslaved, and I really haven't been able to get past that to talk about anything else. They just challenge, no, that's not true. And they say the number can't possibly be that high. They'll say, well, it's all the matter of definitions you use, you know, that it's implying that, well, maybe there's an overly loose definition. Or they'll say that people in slavery today aren't having as difficult a time and awful a time as those who are part of the transatlantic slave trade. Have you run into this and experienced that? It's been an interesting reaction.
Well, a little bit. I have to say yes, a little bit. But you know, starting with the last thing you raised first, I got to tell you that there's a lot of evidence that the treatment of people in slavery today is worse than some of the treatment of people in the transatlantic slave trade. But you know, that said, I don't want to push that idea very hard because both are horrific. You know, I mean, there's a point at which you know, really terrible just becomes really terrible, and you can't get even worse than that. In terms of the numbers, in fact, my estimates are smaller than those that have been used by the United Nations in the past, and my definition's a lot tighter. One of the things that happened after slavery was abolished in the United States, then in Brazil in the 1880s, is that the word kind of came up for grabs, and the definition of slavery started to be a very loose thing indeed. So you have people talking about wage slavery and the slavery of domestic violence, and there's even some groups who lobby in Geneva at the United Nations who say that things like the sale of human organs across borders is a kind of slavery. Even a group that says incest is slavery. Well, I think incest is really terrible. I think it's so terrible we don't need to call it slavery when we've actually got slavery to talk about. I define slavery very, very tightly. I say, in terms of my research, this work, a person is a slave if they're paid absolutely nothing, if they're held against their will under a threat of violence or under violence, and they're economically exploited. That rules out wage slavery, that rules out child labor in factories where the kids are paid something. It's the kind of slavery that I was hoping that no one could debate, that they would say, well, if that's how you define slavery, then, well, we have to admit that that is slavery.
There are those different definitions of slavery. Maybe we can go through like chattel slavery and so forth, parts of it.
Well, I suppose that rather than definitions, I think we're really talking about different forms of slavery. No, that's okay, it's right, because you know, even the United Nations is rather confused about this. There's 6 or 7 different definitions of slavery in the United Nations conventions. There's another 6 definitions of trafficking in people. All of them mean about the same, but they're all a little different. And even this year, there's been work on a new convention on trafficking in people, which is really about buying and selling human beings. So that'll make a 7th one. And you know, with luck, they might even wipe out some of the old ones. But there's been a lot of looseness in the last 50 years in how we define slavery.
When I was reading your book, I was fascinated that you had an example that in Mauritania that that kind of slavery goes back to the Old Testament in its variation. Can you explain that?
Well, I'd be pressed to prove that in fact some of the slavery in Mauritania has existed without break for say 4,000 or 5,000 years, but it's very certainly the kind of slavery. Anyway, this is the way the Mauritanians present it as well. The Mauritanian slaveholders present it, that they feel is very much in line with the Quran, which is in line with the Old Testament, and they see it as a kind of extended family in the same way that you read about the slavery in the Old Testament, and they attempt to present it in that way. I don't think it actually works that way. And when you talk to the people who are enslaved, they sometimes say, well, I feel like I'm part of this extended family. But they also say, I'm pretty badly treated in this extended family, and I'd leave if I could.
I think it'd be important right now for you to show how you went about organizing this project, because that's quite an interest too in the different researches you had in different countries.
Well, one of the things, when I got started, one of the things that I noticed about research on slavery was that there was a fair bit of it that had been done by journalists and a fair bit by human rights researchers. And they carried a common theme, and that was really the theme of outrage. And of course it's outrageous. Of course we should be upset about slavery. But you have to go a bit further than simply exposing the human rights violation if we're really going to do something about it. You have to understand how it works. You know, you can't just say, here's slavery, it's terrible, let's be outraged by it. You have to say, how does this actually fit? Because, and when I say fit, I mean fit into the economy. Because one of the things that, in a sense, we tend to forget about slavery, if we think about it as a human rights violation primarily, is that people don't enslave people to be mean to them. They don't enslave people to be violent to them. They enslave people to use them economically. And that being the case, you've got to understand the economic procedures or the economic business that uses slavery. So that was my goal. I wanted to go to different countries. I picked 5. Where I could look very closely at businesses that were based on slave labor and come to understand, if I could, the way slavery fit into that economic activity with an eye to maybe breaking that chain later on, figuring out how to break that economic chain. Because, like I say, slaveholders will duck and dive as long as people are just saying what you're doing is bad. When it stops making money for them, they might want to get out of slavery.
Why don't we go to each one of those countries and you talk about what you found from them, because I know a lot of our viewers will be interested in some of that detail.
Well, the first country I went to was Thailand. And there I looked at the way young girls are sold into prostitution, into slavery in prostitution. Now, I want to be clear, a lot of people in the West think immediately of those stories about sex tourism in Southeast Asia. But I'm not talking about sex tourism. Enslaved young women are not used in sex tourism. You actually have need to have, as I understand it, a little more freedom of movement for these Western sex tourists, right? Now, in fact, these young women are used in working-class brothels. They're trapped in these working-class brothels, of which there are thousands. And my best estimate is there's probably something like 50,000 young women enslaved in these working-class brothels. Prostitution is absolutely pervasive in Thai culture. It's something very common for men to do. It's a lot like the way people in England go out to the pub together. In Thailand, men often go to a brothel together. And in the same way that people in England go to a pub and one person buys a round of drinks, in Thailand it's normal that you'd go with your buddies after work and one would buy a round of prostitutes. Well, what this means is there's a large number of brothels and a large number of prostitutes. At the low end of that are working class brothels, and into these young girls are sold normally by their parents, sometimes tricked. Sometimes these girls are tricked and the parents are tricked. Sometimes the parents know what's going on. They get about $1,000 for these young girls, usually age 14 or 15. The age has been dropping because there's a real fear of HIV, AIDS, among some of the clients, and they believe that the younger the girl, the less likely they are to get AIDS from the women they use. But to talk about the economic side of it, these young women are usually purchased by a broker for, say, $1,000, who sell them on to the brothel from anywhere from $2,000 to $4,000. But once in the brothel, they're in a kind of debt bondage. The pimp who runs the brothel says to them, "We've paid $4,000 for you. You can forget about that job you thought you were going to get as a waitress. You're actually a prostitute now. If you don't like it, if they try to run away, then they're beaten and raped," that sort of thing. But then they're told you have to pay back all this money before you can leave here, and you have to pay it back by obviously engaging in prostitution. Unfortunately, most of them are illiterate, and they don't get to keep the records anyway, so it means that the people who run the brothels falsify these records, and the women never get out of this debt. So they're in this bondage linked to debt. And it means that these young women are being used by between 10 and 15 men every night for something like $2 or $3 each. In fact, it's a volume business. And the cost of keeping up the girls and feeding them is so low that the profit margin is phenomenally high. Something like 800% a year profit can be made on one of these girls by the people who run the brothels. That's indicative as well of the way this what I call new slavery, is the fact that we've got really high profit margins. Slavery in the past, you know, slavery in Mississippi in 1850 didn't have profit margins like this.
You bring that out in the book, that the master and the slave were often working, you know, in the same place at the same time, but that's not true in the new global situation.
Not so often, or rarely. It can be in places like Mauritania or possibly India, but in fact, slaves are so cheap today. In fact, slaves are cheaper now than they ever have been in the history of the planet. They're at an all-time rock bottom low. And it means that the slaves that would have cost, well, let me give you an example. Let's go back to 1850 Alabama. You could buy a slave, let me say an average slave, for about $1,000. Now, $1,000 in 1850 dollars is about $60,000 to $80,000 today. That's a large investment. And of course, the slave master wanted to have title, you know, legal title, and wanted as well usually to protect that slave from illness and injury. Admittedly, many slaves were injured. Admittedly, they were terribly abused, or could be terribly abused, because it was a question of controlling them. But if control could be exercised, there was no reason why a master would want to, say, kill a slave if they represented such an enormous investment. Plus, they had to keep them alive, or they intended to keep them alive, because profits were much lower, something like 5 to 10%. So you had to get that slave to work for 10 to 15 years just to make back the investment. Today, slaves are available. Agricultural slaves equivalent to slaves of 150 years ago can be purchased today for $100. And that means that they're disposable. They're no longer capital investment items. They're simply parts of an economic process that like an add-in, you know, like the plastic pins that you buy for your office. You know, you buy them in, you use them up, you throw them away.
That's discouraging. That information, yeah.
Well, it is, and it's changed the nature of slavery, so that it's not about ownership; it's about use. In the same way that a lot of manufacturing is not so much these days about, you know, owning land in factories. It's about bringing equipment together, leasing equipment, and bringing just-in-time deliveries of goods to make things happen. Well, slavery's followed the same kind of path. One of the things we've done, see, is to keep our mind locked in the old ideas of slavery. We still think about slavery as if you know, it's still 1865. Well, it's not. You know, slavery is an economic activity too, and it's evolved in the same way that other economic activities have evolved.
Could you also talk about what you found out about slavery in India, for example?
India is very interesting because it's one of the older forms of debt bondage, and it may be one of the most long-lasting. You know, there's been I was working in northern India, in Uttar Pradesh, in an area where we know there to have been debt bondage for something like 4,000 or 5,000 years. It's just been a normal sort of feudalism which has existed there, but without the kind of hierarchy and royalty of feudalism that we think of in European terms. Well, that kind of debt bondage is similar to that in Thailand. A poor farmer goes to a landlord normally and says, I need to borrow some money, I've got to buy medicine for my kids, or I've got to bury my mother, pay for the funeral. But of course, because they have no collateral, the landlord says, that's fine, I'll loan you the money, but you have to, as collateral against the loan, become my bonded servant, my slave. Now, remarkably, again, since the slave is unlikely to be able to read and write or keep track of this, the debt never fades. And I met bonded labor slaves, bonded labor slaves in India who didn't take out a debt, nor did their fathers, but their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers had borrowed money from a landlord, and the debt had been passed down through the generations. And that's not at all uncommon.
You also talk about Brazil, you know, and what was it, brick workers? No, excuse me.
Charcoal making,
yeah.
That's right. Charcoal making in Brazil. That's much more indicative of the kind of temporary enslavement that I call this new slavery. Again, it's a kind of debt bondage. It's based on trickery, for the most part. People in eastern Brazil, in the big favelas, you know, the big shanty towns, they're desperate for jobs. And one day somebody shows up with a truck and says, I've got jobs out in Mato Grosso, out in the west. You know, we're going to clear some land. I need some good workers. I'm going to provide the tools. I'm going to pass out sandwiches right now. You know, here's a little money to give to your family. All you've got to do is hop on the truck and everything will be great. I'm paying this kind of a wage. Well, it's 1,000 miles from the east out to Mato Grosso. When they get out there, they go way out into the boondocks. I mean, they're way out in the countryside. So far out that it's, say, 50 miles walk to the nearest village. When they get off the truck, that's when people often say, well, actually, you owe me a great deal of money. You're not leaving here until you've paid it off according to my reckoning, and you'll see my friends here have all got rifles, so don't even think about leaving. And they'll keep them for the 3, 6 months, 9 months, a year that it takes usually to strip a very large area of forest and turn it into charcoal.
And then there's the brick workers in Pakistan.
Well, that's in Pakistan, it's one of the industries which uses, again, bonded laborers, people who are enslaved into bonded labor. It's a very similar situation. Families, often lower caste families, in Pakistan often Christian families, who are at the bottom of the economic heap. It's not because they're Christians, it's because they're poor that they're being enslaved in this way. But they're enslaved normally for 6-month seasons, which is the brick making season. It goes for about 6 months, stops for a couple of months, goes for another, and rotates like that. They have to stop when the rains come. Sometimes the families are held into the next season, sometimes they're let go. But there's no way out. And the fraudulent bookkeeping against this debt serves to keep them enslaved.
Seems to be a recurring theme throughout, is that it's a fraudulent apparatus that concocts these frameworks.
Well, all over the world, you see, with slavery illegal, you can't have a bill of sale, you can't have a title. You need some other way to exercise some kind of control over people. Now, what I found really remarkable was the honesty of slaves. I mean, it was touching and a little surprising that when I would sometimes say to charcoal makers in Brazil who were clearly enslaved, who were being tricked, who had been tricked into it, but were aware of the falsification of the records and that sort of thing, I'd say, look, why don't you walk away? They said, well, a debt is a debt. He may be lying to us. I know the debt's false, but I've got to be seen as a person who pays my debts. You know, he may not be honest, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be honest, be dishonest.
In your book, you argue that today all over the world the conditions are right for slavery, and although it's against the law almost everywhere, slavery grows, and that a major dynamic is the global economy. Could you explain why you think this is the case, particularly in terms of global economic links, major economic changes, and what you referred to several times and already here, the easier avoidance of responsibility by the greater distance between master and slave these days.
Well, you've layered up several points there, but
Sure.
let me try and take them one at a time. You know, to make slavery happen today, you've got to have really three ingredients. You've got to have people to enslave. That's pretty easy. We've had a population explosion since the Second World War. There are lots of people out there. But those people have also got to be economically vulnerable. You know, you can't enslave rich people unless you kidnap them at gunpoint. But it's harder to do that. Rich people have protections. So you've got to have a lot of people, and they've got to be very poor. Well, that's where the global economics comes in. You know, one of the things that we know is that since the 1960s, there's been a tremendous shift in the world economy, a globalization of the economy. And one of the things that's entailed is a push of people away from subsistence agricultures into cash crops in the developing world, and also a push of people off the land and into the cities in the developing world. Well, both of those are very good ways to make people move from subsistence into a state of high vulnerability, really into a state of unemployment. Now, of course, even if you've got lots of people and they're very poor, that's still not enough to make them slaves. You've still got to have the third crucial ingredient, and that is about governmental corruption. You've got to be able to use violence to enslave people. As long as a state, a government, maintains a monopoly over violence, which is what governments are supposed to do. You know, governments are supposed to control the police and control the army. They're supposed to have a monopoly over violence. Then slavery won't happen. Or if it does happen, it can be stopped. When the government or the police start to put violence up for sale, which is what happens, unfortunately, a great deal in the developing world, then you can use, well, what you do then is declare an open season to capture slaves. When there are plenty of people and they're poor enough, and you've got the right or the purchased privilege to use violence to harvest those people, then you've got slavery. And that's why it's growing. In countries around the world, governments are not able to control those who have the means of violence, or they're actively participating with those people who have the means of violence to use that violence to enslave others.
And you mentioned some of those controversies that have come up about the use of workers for Nike or, you know, large corporate manufacturers, and I think that has also to do with the text that you have in the book about what can you do about global slavery.
Jim, I got to say, I don't have a lot to say about Nike because they actually paid those workers. They weren't paid very well, and as I understand it, the conditions in which they were working were terrible. But under my definition, that's not slavery. It's a terrible situation, but it's not one of those things I look at. So I have to tell you, I haven't looked closely at that kind of thing. And I'll admit as well, there's certainly some gray areas. You know, there are certainly areas where people say they're paying people, but they're not really, or they pay people occasionally, but only occasionally, and the rest of the time they're actually working for nothing, where I have to say, well, maybe these are slaves, maybe they're not. But, that said, in terms of the links that tie us potentially to slavery, it's not so much that we have so many clear-cut examples. And you mentioned Nike and the people making shoes. Like that. We don't have so many clear-cut examples of that because, for the most part, slavery is used in very low-skill work. It's used in the kind of work that's processing raw materials or making bits that are used by other people to make other products. Those charcoal makers are a classic example in Brazil. They're not making charcoal so you can use it in your barbecue. That's not what that's about. They're actually shipping that charcoal to the steel mills in eastern Brazil, where it's a key ingredient in making steel from Brazilian iron ore. Now, the Brazilian steel industry ships something like, I think, $1.5 billion worth of steel just to the U.S., and they ship to the whole world. That steel goes into things like car parts, maybe barbecue grills, furniture, you name it. So, can we see very clearly the slave input to the set of new shock absorbers that we have to buy for our car? No. But is there a link? Yes. Now, I wish I could tell you about very clear linkages. But in fact, that's research yet to be done. One of the things that I set out to do in this work was to begin to do the groundwork so that we could understand where we now have to look to find clear links between multinational companies, slave labor, and what we need to do as consumers.
So the next step would be working from defining some of this to enlarging that statistical information, or?
All of the above. As we speak, as they say, as we speak, I have a couple of people in Brazil tracing land records to find out who owns land in Brazil. And a lot of land in western Brazil is owned by multinational corporations. In another year, we're going to have a lot better information about who owns the land on which slave labor is being used.
That's tough in Brazil, if I remember correctly. That's, you know, there's a lot of ways that that's sort of disguised and worked around, and special arrangements and all that stuff.
All of that's true, and it's also true that when some companies have been caught out, they've said, you know, we just bought the land as part of a tax deal with the Brazilian government. We subcontracted that work to someone, and they subcontracted it again to someone else. So we didn't really know what was going on there. Well, you know, I don't know if you're willing, because I'm certainly not willing to accept that. You know, I think if they're going to own the land, they're going to have to be responsible for what happens on it. And I think it's probably going to have to come down to us as consumers and citizens of the world to call them on it.
How did you get into this topic with your research?
You know, I went to an event, a kind of conference once about 10 years ago. I'd worked in human rights for a long time in different areas. But I went to a conference and I bumped into some people from Anti-Slavery International. That's the oldest human rights organization in the world. And I picked up some of the information they had that talked about the number of people in slavery, and I was just amazed. I was amazed. I was, like most people, I thought that slavery had pretty much ended in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Now, what their information didn't do was give me the kind of depth of analysis that I would have liked to have had. You know, it raised more questions in my mind than it answered. And one of them was about just how many people are in slavery. So that's really what pushed me ahead to undertake this kind of research.
As I discussed with you before, while this program is intended to look at scholarly issues and not at solutions, you do indicate in your book different kinds of organizations that people could contact if they did have want to get a little more active in trying to, you know, I don't know if you could eliminate slavery, but become more aware and work toward that. What are some of those organizations?
Well, the key one is Anti-Slavery International. There's also, of course, in the United States, Human Rights Watch.
Well, thank you for appearing on our program.
It's been my pleasure.